The wine has run out. Not late in the evening. Not after the toasts have finished and the guests have gone home. The wine runs out while the party is still full, while the music is still playing. In the middle of a wedding in a town called Cana, a town so small it barely earns a mention anywhere else in ancient history. And in that culture, running out of wine at a wedding wasn't an awkward moment. It was a public disgrace. The kind of family carried for years. A woman notices first. She's the mother of one of the guests. And she leans toward her son and says 5 words that will change the rest of his life. They have no wine. He tells her it isn't his problem yet. She doesn't argue. She simply turns to the servants standing near 6 enormous stone jars, the kind used for ceremonial washing, not for drinking, and says, "Do whatever he tells you." So the servants fill the jars with water. Plain, ordinary water, carried by hand, jar by jar, under a roof lit by oil lamps. And when the master of the wedding tastes what comes out of those jars a few minutes later, he doesn't call for the groom to scold him for running dry. He calls for him to ask where he's been hiding the good stuff. You need to understand what just happened in that room. Nobody saw it. There was no flash of light. No crowd gasping. No dramatic gesture. A handful of servants knew. That's it. The first miracle Jesus of Nazareth ever performed in public was small, private, and almost embarrassingly domestic, a favor at a wedding. Done quietly. So quietly that most of the guests kept eating and never knew anything unusual had happened at all. Hold on to that, because at the very end of his life, on a hill outside Jerusalem, in front of soldiers and mockers and a crowd loud enough to be heard from the walls of the city, Jesus will perform a miracle that could not be more different. Public, violent, impossible to look away from. And somehow, the two are connected. We'll come back to that. This is not a magic show. This is not a list of party tricks performed to impress a crowd. This is not folklore dressed up in old language and passed down until it lost its edges. This is a pattern, a sequence. In order, from the first sign to the last, and once you see where it's going, you can't stop seeing it. So picture yourself at that wedding for a second. One of the guests who never noticed anything happened at all. Then let's start where it started. At a wedding, with a mother, 6 stone jars, and water that had no business turning into wine. Here's what most people miss about how the Gospels tell this story. They don't drop you into a random miracle every few chapters. They build a case, one scene at a time, like a lawyer laying out evidence before a jury. And the second scene in that case takes you north, to a town called Capernaum, where a Roman official is standing in front of Jesus with a request no Roman would normally make of a Jewish teacher. His son is dying, not sick, dying, and this man, a man with soldiers under his command, a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed instantly, has come to beg. Jesus tells him to go home. That's it. No visit to the bedside. No hand laid on the boy's forehead. Just 4 words, "Your son will live." And the official turns and walks home. And somewhere on that road, his servants meet him with the news that the fever broke at the exact hour Jesus spoke those words. Miles away. Think about what that tells you. This isn't proximity. This isn't touch. This is authority working at a distance. The way an order given in one city can move an army in another. The Greek word the Gospel writers reach for again and again isn't trick or wonder, it's dynamis. Power, a force breaking into the ordinary world the way electricity breaks into a dark room. But it gets stranger. Back in Capernaum, on a Sabbath, Jesus is teaching in the synagogue when a man possessed by an unclean spirit starts shouting at him, naming him, exposing him, trying to control him the way you might expect a spirit to try to control anything it fears. Jesus doesn't negotiate. He commands the spirit to leave. And it does. Immediately. In front of everyone. Then, within hours, in the same town, in Simon Peter's own house, Jesus takes the hand of Peter's mother-in-law, burning with fever, and the fever leaves her so completely that she gets up and starts serving the meal herself. Do you see what's happening here? In one day, in one small town, Jesus has confronted a spiritual power nobody in that synagogue wanted to name out loud. And then walked into a family's private grief and ended it with a touch. Authority in public, compassion in private, same man, same day. Stay with me, because the next scene takes you to a lake, and to a fisherman who is about to have the worst night of his career turn into the best morning of his life. Simon Peter has been fishing all night and caught nothing. Nothing at all. He's tired, frustrated, and probably a little embarrassed, washing out empty nets on the shore while a crowd gathers to hear Jesus teach. Jesus asks to use his boat as a floating platform, and when he's finished speaking, he tells Peter to push out into deep water and try again. Peter, who knows this lake better than Jesus does, points out, respectfully, that this makes no sense. They've been at it all night. But he does it anyway. The nets come up so full they start to tear. Peter has to call for a second boat. And even then, both boats nearly sink under the weight of the catch. And Peter, a grown man, a professional, not easily rattled, falls to his knees in the bottom of that boat. Soaking wet, surrounded by more fish than he's ever seen in one place. And says the truest sentence he's ever spoken, "Leave me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." That's the pattern again, power that provides. And right behind it, in the very next scene, power that touches what everyone else refuses to touch, a man covered in leprosy. Skin ruined by a disease that got him thrown out of every town he'd ever lived in. Forced to shout warnings so no one would come near him by accident. He comes to Jesus anyway, kneels anyway, says, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus reaches out, with his own hand, and touches him. Before the healing happens, before the disease is gone, Jesus touches a man that an entire society had trained itself never to touch. And only after that does he say, "Be clean." The healing is the miracle everyone remembers. The touch is the miracle nobody talks about. And it might be the harder one. Here's the part nobody tells you. The very next miracle in this sequence isn't really about a disease at all. Some men carry their paralyzed friend to a house so packed with people that they can't get through the door. So they climb onto the roof, tear a hole in it, and lower him down on a mat, right in front of Jesus. And Jesus looks at a paralyzed man he's never met and says something that has nothing to do with his legs: "Your sins are forgiven." The religious leaders in the room go rigid. Because forgiving sins isn't a doctor's job. It isn't a rabbi's job. It's the kind of claim that only makes sense if you believe you have the authority of God himself. Jesus, watching them react, asks a simple question. Is it easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Get up and walk"? Then he says the second one. And the man gets up and walks in front of everyone. The healing was never just about the legs. It was proof for a claim you couldn't see with your eyes, the claim that mattered more. So pause with me for 1 second. Because it's worth naming what you've actually seen so far. A wedding running out of wine. A dying boy healed from miles away. A spirit that had to obey a command it didn't want to obey. A fever that broke on contact. A net that couldn't hold what it caught. A disease that had exiled a man from his own town. Undone by a single touch. A paralyzed man walking out of a house he was carried into. Every single one of those is doing the same thing. Pointing past itself. Not proving that Jesus was powerful. Plenty of people in the ancient world claimed power. Proving something much more specific about who he said he was. And we're not even halfway through the list. If you're finding this as strange and as compelling as I did putting it together, this is the kind of video this channel exists to make, so if you haven't yet, subscribe, and stay with me, because the next stretch is where the stakes stop being personal and start becoming impossible to explain away. Now watch what happens next. Because the stakes start climbing in a way that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Back in a synagogue, on another Sabbath, there's a man in the crowd with a withered hand, shrunken. Useless, probably from birth. The religious leaders in the room aren't watching the man. They're watching Jesus, waiting to see if he'll heal on the Sabbath so they can accuse him of breaking the law. Jesus knows exactly what they're doing. He asks the man to stand up in front of everyone. Asks the room a question. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Or only harm? And when nobody answers, he tells the man to stretch out his hand. It's whole, immediately, in front of the very people building a case against him. And this is where it gets remarkable. The miracle wasn't really the point of the confrontation anymore. The confrontation was the point. Jesus wasn't just healing hands at this stage of his ministry. He was picking a fight with the people who thought they owned the definition of holy, and he kept picking it. Healing on the Sabbath again and again, as if he wanted them to notice. But personal stakes are one thing. What comes next is a funeral. Outside a town called Nain, a widow is walking behind a coffin. Her husband is already dead and buried. Now her only son is dead too. Which means, In that world, she has lost everything: her family, her protection, her future. A crowd walks with her, the way a whole town turns out for grief it can't fix. And Jesus, arriving from the other direction with his own crowd, sees her before she sees him. He doesn't wait to be asked. Nobody begs him for this one. He simply looks at a grieving mother he's never met. Feels. The gospel writers use a word here, splanchnosomai, which means something closer to gut-level compassion than polite sympathy, and tells her not to cry. Then he walks up to the open coffin, tells the dead boy to get up, and the boy sits up and starts talking. Try to picture the sound in that crowd. Not applause, silence, and then screaming. And then a mother getting her son back in the same breath she thought she'd lost him forever. That's grief, turned inside out in real time. And the very next scene takes the fear somewhere else entirely, not death, not disease, but nature itself, the one thing no ancient person believed any human being could control. Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Sea of Galilee at night when a storm hits, and this isn't a light rain. Mark's gospel describes waves crashing into the boat so hard it's filling with water while Jesus, astonishingly, is asleep in the back. These are professional fishermen, men who have survived storms on this lake their whole lives. And they are certain they are about to drown. They wake him up, half furious, half terrified. Don't you care that we're going to die? Jesus stands up, says a handful of words to the wind and the water, not a prayer, not a request, a command, and the sea goes flat. Not calming down, flat, immediately. The disciples' fear doesn't go away when the storm does. It changes shape. They go from being afraid of the waves to being afraid of the man standing in front of them. Because a man who can speak to wind and water and be obeyed isn't just a healer or a teacher anymore. Something in the categories they built for him just broke. Pay attention to this. Right after that boat reaches the other shore, Jesus meets a man living among the tombs, so violent and so tormented that the townspeople had given up trying to chain him. He's possessed by so many spirits they call themselves Legion, the name of a Roman army unit, thousands of men. Jesus casts him out with a word, and the man who used to howl among the graves is later found sitting calmly, fully dressed, fully himself, begging to come with him. And on the way back across that same region, in the middle of a crushing crowd, a woman who has been bleeding for 12 straight years, 12 years of being unclean, untouchable, unable to enter a synagogue or embrace her own family without violating the law, reaches out and touches the edge of Jesus' robe. Just the edge, and the bleeding stops that instant. Jesus stops the entire crowd to find her, not to expose her, but to say the words she probably hadn't heard directed at her in over a decade: "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." 12 years of shame, undone in one touch nobody else even saw. There's one more thing you need to know before we get to the story that changes everything, because right before it, Jesus is interrupted by a man whose panic you'll recognize even if you've never lived in the ancient world. Jairus is a synagogue leader, a respected man, the kind of person other people come to for help, and he is running, pushing through a crowd, falling at Jesus' feet, because his 12-year-old daughter is dying. And every minute Jesus spends walking instead of running is a minute he might not have. If you've ever sat in a hospital waiting room with your phone in your hand, staring at a door, waiting for someone in scrubs to walk through it and tell you something you're afraid to hear, you already know exactly what's happening in Jairus' chest. And then, on the way to his house, Jesus stops, for the bleeding woman, for someone else entirely, and you can imagine what that must have felt like for Jairus. Every second of delay feeling like a stone in his stomach, until messengers arrive with the words no parent wants to hear: "Your daughter is dead." Why bother him further? But Jesus doesn't turn around. He tells Jairus one thing: don't be afraid. Just believe. And when they reach the house, past the mourners already gathered, already grieving, already certain of how this story ends, Jesus walks into the room where the girl is lying, takes her hand, and says 2 words: "Little girl, get up." And she does, immediately, as if she'd only been asleep. That's the moment the fear of death itself starts to bend. And it keeps climbing. A crowd of 5,000 men, not counting women and children, which likely means closer to 15 or 20,000 people, has followed Jesus into an empty stretch of land with no food and no way to get any. A boy has 5 loaves and 2 small fish. That's it. Jesus takes the little there is, gives thanks, breaks it, and it does not run out. Basket after basket, until everyone has eaten and there's more left over than they started with. Not long after, he does it again for 4,000 more. Then, at night, on that same lake where the storm once terrified them, the disciples see something walking toward their boat on top of the water itself. And for a moment they're more afraid of what looks like a ghost than they ever were of the waves. It's Jesus, walking on the surface of the sea the way you'd walk across a room. Provision that doesn't run out. Feet on water that shouldn't hold weight. A God who doesn't just rescue you from nature, who walks on top of it. And now, hold that thought, because everything you've watched so far, every healing, every storm calmed, every raising from death, has been building toward one scene in a town called Bethany. Lazarus is a close friend of Jesus. Not a stranger, not a crowd member, a friend. With two sisters, Mary and Martha, who send word that he's sick. By the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has been dead 4 days. In that climate, 4 days meant no ambiguity, no hope of resuscitation. His body had already begun to decompose. Martha meets Jesus on the road and says the hardest sentence in the whole story: "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." And Jesus doesn't argue with her grief. He weeps. The gospel says it plainly. Jesus, standing outside his friend's tomb, weeps, even though he knows what he's about to do. Then he tells them to roll the stone away. Martha objects, the smell will be unbearable after 4 days. He tells her to believe anyway. And when the stone is rolled back, Jesus doesn't pray a long prayer or perform a ritual. He says one sentence, loud enough for the crowd to hear: "Lazarus, come out." And a man 4 days dead walks out of his own grave, still wrapped in the cloths they buried him in. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades later in a work with no reason to flatter Jesus' followers, still records that Jesus had a reputation in his own lifetime as a man who did startling, unexplainable things, evidence that even people outside the faith couldn't ignore what was happening. This is not a story about a wedding running low on wine. This is not a story about a fever, or a storm, or a crowd that needed feeding. This is a story about a pattern that climbs, deliberately, from provision, to healing, to power over nature, to power over death itself, and it was never going to stop there. Remember the wedding, remember the quiet miracle nobody outside that room even noticed, done for a mother's sake. At the very beginning. Now go to the end of the story, to a hill outside Jerusalem, where Jesus is dying in public, in the loudest, most violent way the Roman Empire knew how to kill a man. A criminal hanging beside him, dying for his own crimes, turns his head and asks for nothing more than to be remembered. And Jesus, in the middle of his own execution, tells him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." The first miracle turned an ending, an empty wedding, a family's shame, into a beginning nobody at that party even recognized as one. And the last miracle before the grave does the same thing. For a dying man nobody else would have bothered to save. Quiet to loud, private to public, water to blood, the same hands, doing the same thing, from the first day of his ministry to the last hour of his life, turning what looks like the end into a door. And 3 days after that hill outside Jerusalem, the tomb they put him in is empty. So here's what you're actually left with, once you line up 30-something miracles in the order the Gospels give them to you. Takeaway 1, they were never random. Every miracle in this list sits exactly where it needed to sit: provision, then healing, then authority over nature, then authority over death. That's not a coincidence, a group of fishermen and tax collectors invented by accident decades later. That's a pattern, and patterns are built on purpose. Takeaway 2, and this is the one that matters for you personally: every miracle on this list answers a fear you've actually felt. Running out of something you needed, being sick and unseen, losing someone you love, being afraid in a storm you can't control, being the one person in the room nobody wants to touch. There isn't a single miracle in this video that isn't also, quietly, a question aimed straight at you: do you believe he can still do this? And takeaway 3, the one I want you to sit with longer than the others. The same hands that turned water into wine at a wedding nobody important attended are the same hands that turned a criminal's dying breath into a promise of paradise. And the same hands that came out of a tomb 3 days after they were nailed to a cross. If he can turn an ending like that into a beginning, he can do it with whatever ending you're staring at right now. Which miracle in this list would you have wanted to witness with your own eyes? Tell me below. I read every one. Because in the end, this was never just a list of 30-something things Jesus did. It's the story of a God who kept showing up in the worst moment of someone's life, a wedding running dry, a fever burning hot, a storm no one could survive, a grave already sealed, and turning every single one of them into the moment everything changed.